Well, good afternoon. So this is Suicide Note Video 3. I've decided to dedicate this one in part to my father's backstory. I think I gave you a little bit of his childhood history. This is going to go more towards when he absconded with my grandmother, his mother's uh, assets. Um, so jumping back maybe 30 odd years, my step grandfather, my grandfather's or grandmother's husband, he died of leukemia. Now, my grandmother, who, given her generation, didn't drive, couldn't write a check, uh, had, you know, a very limited number of things she could do. So my father started helping her with all that. On the surface, that looks like what a dutiful son. But after a few years, he decided to move in with her, um, take care of her. And I think there started the nightmare for my grandmother. And I know of this personally. Um, I was still living in Denver at the time this occurred, and my brother and sister were already in California. So, how to start this story? Well, maybe a year or two go by that my dad's in with my grandmother, and she calls me crying. You have no idea how your father talks to me. You have no idea how mean he is. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. No one acts against my father. I'm trying to sympathize with her, yet not do anything. But it also started a conversation with my grandmother and I. So periodically, I would stop over. When my dad, of course, wasn't there and was at work, we would have coffee, and she would start telling me stories of her life, her childhood, relatives that I'd never heard of before. She was a wonderful storyteller and a really wonderfully kind person. Now, to paint a little bigger picture, um, my mother hated my grandmother, did not have a nice thing to say about her. She was jealous of my grandmother because she felt my father would listen to my grandmother, take her direction instead of my mother. I believed that to be true at the time. I was conflicted because my horrible things my mother would say about my grandmother, yet my grandmother was an incredibly nice person. As our relationships go, I'm sure they're very complicated. Um, but what I would then find out years or decades later is my dad didn't have any more feeling for anyone but himself and not my grandmother. So what started happening is my grandmother, like I said, started not all the time, three occasions in maybe a couple of years. Um, but I would start having conversations with my father of, you know, that he had my grandmother sign over all of her assets, including the house, into his name, because if she had to go in a nursing home, he wouldn't have to pay anything. Um, and I know this is true because when it came for me to set up, facilities for my mother, I thought, it's going to be free. It's not that way. What happens is, if the person shows no assets, they can go on Medicaid, or in California's sake, or instance, Um, they go on Medi-Cal. Um, my grandmother, you know, not a wealthy woman, but had modest assets, the house and income from the railroad and her Social Security, and a small amount of money set aside. I know about the small amount of money set aside because on four separate occasions that I can specifically remember, my grandmother would say, "You know what? I'm not a rich woman. I don't have a lot, but I put a little bit aside for an inheritance for you, your brother, and sister." And even at the time, I thought $200 or $300 maybe. It was the thought, not the money. And I'll get into this a little later. Um, but anyway, with increasing frequency, I could feel my grandmother's distress with my father. This is, I started to feel horrible. I didn't know what to do. Um, my grandmother was starting to slip into dementia and would call my father by her brother, which was her brother's name, which would drive my father insane, thinking she was doing that on purpose. I got a look a little bit at how he treated her, but I think he was still pretty guarded on how he treated her around me. I always felt that she slipped into dementia to mentally get away from my father. Um, all of this would come full circle. Well, not full circle. All this would come apparent. Back in the day, and we're talking the 80s, early 90s, maybe 80s, there was no Home Depot. I don't know if there was True Value. I hadn't heard of it. The hardware store to go to in those days was Builder's Hardware. One Saturday, mid-morning, somewhere between 10 and noon, I was in a Builder's Hardware. I believe it was at Florida and Holly, around there. And I'm in one of the store and I hear this person screaming at the top of their lungs at someone. My first reaction was shock. My second was I thought it was funny. So I was going to creep by and just look at who would be so outrageous as to scream at someone like that. I no more turned the corner than to see my father screaming at my grandmother. His back was, he couldn't really see me as I turned the corner, so my grandmother was literally crumpled between a column and the shelves, just horrified. I was horrified. I all but crawled out of the store. This would haunt me really now till the rest of my life, that I didn't do anything to help my grandmother. I felt horrible for years for not calling the authority for elder abuse. Now, if you're physically beating on someone, you've got the marks. When you're emotionally and verbally beating on someone, there's no physical signs. I don't know what's worse. I've never been physically abused, but I would feel like I'd far rather be physically abused than mentally and verbally and emotionally abused. And it was really shortly after that she slept into dementia. I moved to California. I think a very short time after that, her dementia got to the point that my dad had to send her, for into a nursing home. And I remember him at the time how horrible the place was because it was a Medicaid facility. He did not spend the money to get her into anywhere better. That's my father. He would say how she'd cry, and he would say how dirty it was. He would say that, the attendant stole from her, that he would have to do her laundry because they wouldn't, and he'd go in and she was a mess. I'll tell this story later, but I had to find a facility for my mother. So I went to look at everywhere from Medi-Cal, which is Medicaid, all the way up to $10,000 a month facilities. So at that time, I got a clear idea what my father had done to my grandmother. By absconding with her assets, he put her in the best of the worst places you could go so he could keep the money. So I think she was in there maybe less than a year and a half before she died. But when she died, guess what? There was no little inheritance to my father took the money. I don't know if there was a will. We never asked or even thought there might be a will. But even at the time, I thought, she don't leave us anything. I got nothing from the woman. I didn't want anything from the money. It was the principle of the matter that my father would steal what little bit of money, a couple $100 she put aside to keep for himself. That is my father. So he would now live in that house another at least 30 or 35 years. So I started, let's do the math. If he had sold the house at the time or bought the house for my grandmother so she had the funds to be put in a good place, he would have had to pay, let's say average, $2,000 a month for a mortgage. Or, heck, $2,000 a month for rent. He never invested a single cent into the mortgage of the house that he now, quick deeded himself over to. I'm sure he would have received it, in a will anyway. But I figure, 35 years of not having to pay rent or mortgage at $2,000 a month, say on average, over that time period, that's $600,000 he didn't have to pay out. And I'll put on top of that the $30,000 I saved him for not having to use a realtor, the realtor's fee, when the house sold. And I'll go into more of that later. My dad saved himself $630,000 there, made $600,000 off the sale of the house, for a total of $1.2 million plus $30,000. That's my dad, that's my dad. And like I had said, we have many layers and they're all interconnected. So I'll connect some of these dots further on. But that's my dad and my grandmother and why he gets to be at Brookdale, a 4-star senior living facility, assisted and independent. And he put his grandmother into Medicaid facility. That's my dad, right? It's all about him. It's mine. It's mine. So that's just exactly how my dad sounds to me when he's screaming at me. It's mine. Like he's a 3-year-old. It's mine. A greedy, selfish 3-year-old. So, I carried that guilt with me forever, that I didn't report him or protect my grandmother because I simply was not capable of standing up against my dad. It was easier to ignore it. Now, jump ahead decades, and I'm put in the same abusive situation living under my dad's, care. That'd be the wrong word. Living in my dad's house or my grandmother's house at the time. And I saw how he spoke to me. I completely understood what my grandmother was up against. And that grandmother didn't mean any more to him than my mother or myself did. And a little story there is we were, um, before my dad completely couldn't move through the grocery store to shop for himself, I would have to, shop with him. He'd push the cart and I'd help him. And what would take me 15, 20 minutes took us 2 hours. That's what you do with old people. So we did that. And I can't remember. We turned the corner where the crackers and condiments are on one aisle, and then you have produce for the rest of the store, so it's all open, right? I don't know what I did, but my dad is, whatever it was, screaming at me at the top of his, and when I say scream, I'm talking at the top of his lungs. I can't even remember what he said. I mean, I was caught between thinking this is hysterically funny, shocked and horrified all in the same moment. I remember there's 3 or 4 people in produce, and they're all like, and people did the same thing that I did with when my grandmother. They would kind of creep around the corner to look what was going on. I just looked at him, kept my mouth shut, walked out to the car. It was kind of like, I don't care, Dad. If you can't make it out of the store, I don't give a fuck. But my dad is a resource. As much as he wants to come across as this little old man, my dad's resourceful. He might be losing his memory, but that man is resourceful. Resourceful about me. Sure enough, he made it out to the car with his groceries. Never said I'm sorry, never mentioned it. And me and my typical me is I'm avoiding an argument, so I'm not going to say anything. But I just thought all of these things start to come together. What my grandmother had to go through, what I had to go through. I mean, my dad can come across as a nice guy, but underneath, I have never met anyone more fucked up in the head than my dad. And you would never know it because he goes to great lengths to be the good old boy, nice guy. I think my grandmother, my mother, me, and a little bit of my sister truly saw that fucked up side of him. And here I am again. I was trapped with my brother, and here I am trapped with my father. What does that say about me? I mean, seriously, what does that say about me? Truly. I do think back, and there were friends who would have taken me in. I just didn't want to burden them with that. One friend that I thought would said no. Rudely said no. But my other friends, they possibly would have. I'm sure they would have. I just wouldn't want to burden them. It was for me and my sense of well-being. It was better for me to take the abuse from my father than want to possibly lose a friend because I became needy. That's just me. So that's one little dad story. But since I've told you I have had months and months, mostly at night, to think about myself, my situation, my life, stories started to pop up, like one of the earliest memories I have of my dad and I. My dad was a phenomenal baseball player, phenomenal. The story, I don't know if it's true, but the story I remember as being true is my dad was actively looked at to be recruited directly in the minors in baseball from high school. That's how good he was. But it was World War II, and he went into the war instead. So my dad, had a phenomenal arm on him. He takes me out to play, baseball or play catch like every father and son does. I never threw like a girl, but I had a weak arm, and I throw all over the place. My dad spent less than 5 minutes with me throwing. I so frustrated him that he just turns his back on me and walks in. I am crushed as a kid. I am crushed. Never offered to play catch with me again. Okay, whatever. Jump ahead 2 or 3 years. So if I was 6 and 7 then, I am now 9 or 10, ending Cub Scouts. And this Cub Scouts leader was a friend of mine's father. The friend was Danny Williams. A wonderfully nice guy, I remember, wonderfully nice. And one of his objectives was to get us all to be good softball players. So he took his Cub Scout group, there must have been 8 or 9 of us, to a ball field once a week for an hour. And, like in any group of kids, you got the boys that can do it all phenomenal. You got those who are average and those who can't. I could always hit a ball, but, throwing's always been kind of an issue for me. He went out and he honed the skills of the good people, and those who are average or not good. He taught us, specifically, he taught me how to throw. Now, would I ever become a great arm? No. I always kind of had a weak arm, but he taught me how to throw at least somewhat accurately. I became a okay softball player, certainly not to be embarrassed. I learned to hit the ball fairly good. I would say very good. I was a much better hitter than I was a fielder. That's because he took the time to teach me something my dad couldn't do. I mean, not only could he not do it, in his own way, he shamed me for not being the son he wanted, that good old boy guy. That's one story. Other story is, my dad was fixated on my friends, not me, but my friends, when we were 9 to 12. Never after we reached puberty, but pre-puberty, it was always kind of, even then it was creepy, but I don't believe anything really happened, and I've thought about it a bunch. Was he a, predator who would never act on it, or was he a damaged kid that never got past 12 years old? I'm thinking it's kind of the latter. He wanted to be best friends with my friends without me. Now, 2 stories here. One is, I'm able to throw, catch, and bat by now. We'd go out, and I think the game was 21. We'd either be out in the street or in someone's backyard, but when we went to my backyard, my dad would come out. And he's the one that would throw the ball up, and then you'd catch it, whatever. He would throw the ball to all my friends but me. And I can remember this like it's yesterday. Time and time again. To the point I got so hurt and destroyed, I'd run into the house crying. Now, you would think a parent would come in and say, it's okay, I love you. Not my dad. My dad didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. It was like he looking back. I mean, again, can't see into the hearts or minds, but my impression of what he did was he took great joy in seeing me tortured and suffered. That's my dad. What was the other one? Oh, yes. Same timeline, somewhere between 9 and 12. One of the friends on the block, father, took us in the back of his pickup to A&W root beer for a root beer float. My dad was, I have to do that. And it probably wasn't, even then it looked like you're just trying to copy this other father. But, so he gets, all the boys, never girls, boys on the block to go. Last minute, I get grounded. I can't remember for what. I don't even know if there was anything. So I'm excluded, but he takes all my friends for Rupert floats. Here I am at 64, you know, uh, putting together, compiling a suicide note. And these are my memories. These are the things that scarred me for life. you know, because none of them, I would have had them all packed away if this last 10 years didn't happen. You know, Parents do things to kids all the time, either purposely or unpurposely. It just happens, and you carry those issues for the rest of your life, yada, yada, yada. We all get that. But my dad and we didn't have a relationship. We ended there. I knew by 11, I divorced my dad, eventually my mom. Right? I had no emotion for them, no love, no hurt. They couldn't hurt me, whatever. And certainly, I was never going to ask that bastard for money. Again, I did in college for tuition. I told you about that. He'd offer, I'd go to collect a check. He would insult and humiliate. I would react. He'd insult and humiliate more. I'd walk away. And again, by the time of fall semester, I knew I was not ever going to ask that man for money. And I didn't. Jump ahead 40 years. Don't have anything else on my dad at the moment. Not that I can think of. My next little segment's going to be on my sister. And there's not that much there because we didn't really have that much of a relationship. But there's enough said that I want to just go on record because she is really the instigator of my situation. Anyway, so I'll catch up with you next time.